Since at the end of my last lecture, I deftly sidestepped the issue of the new technical communicator called a stenographer-typist at Lukens Steel, I'm free to end this lecture series not by discussing technical communication, but by discussing business management instead. In my analysis of the archives, in these years the most important thing was management, not technology. The business had grown, but the business structure had remained the same, as if there were still 17 men working at a single site instead of around 1,500 in a whole series of buildings spread out all over several acres. Charles Lukens Houston helped to solve the problem by using what Christopher McKenna has called, and this is the title of his book, the world's newest profession, consulting. Technical communication had stabilized. It had grown to be an integral part of almost every aspect of the industrial process. If a workman didn't handle paper and pen, he spoke to others who did. They took his words and turned it into text. As Joanne Yates wrote in Control Through Communication, the individual memory had to be replaced by a corporate one. She was talking about business, but the same was true of technology. Paper became the tie that binds, sending orders and knowledge up and down the chain. Much of this writing was done by stenographer-typists who took dictation and then made those words magically appear on pages of flawless typed text. This was often done in triplicate. Carbon paper became widely used after 1910, and, like with contemporary email attachments and copy-all lists, sometimes it was misused as well. Having stenographer-typists encouraged verbosity. Drawing was integral to the industrial process, too. If you want to know more about that, listen to my series on images in industry. Like the machinery itself, drawing and writing had become a tool with which people made things. Lukens faced a new problem common to businesses that had begun early in the 19th century. It had outgrown its method of management. Originally, it was an owner-operated business run by one or two partners. This sort of managerial structure is fine for small businesses, but Lukens had become a large company and the management of it had spiraled out of control. The number of people who worked there was a moving target, changing continually, and the men were paid in cash from the back of a truck. Each mill, shop, or furnace ostensibly reported to Charles Lukens Houston, but the rift between the brothers, Charles and Abram, was mirrored in rifts throughout the plant, so that workers reported to their favorite foreman, or even Charles Lukens Houston himself, if they wanted to. In the book called The Visible Hand, Alfred Chandler wrote about how the modern system of capitalistic management emerged between the years 1850 and 1920. At Lukens, this shift happened in 1925. Lukens was late in undertaking modern management, partially because as long as their income outstripped their expenses, they didn't need to. They only did things when they had to. It was the building of the big mill, Mill Number 5, that precipitated the shift into modern management at Lukens Steel. They had started the mill during World War I when they relied on government contracts. In 1918, Number 5 rolled its first steel. In 1919, the war was over and the government canceled its contracts. Lukens laid off workers, cut the remaining workers' wages, took no dividends, and took out a mortgage on their property for the first time. The company had hit hard times before, but they were flexible and survived. They already had experience using consultants for accounting purposes, and now some of these companies sent out circulars offering engineering consultants on a trial basis. Charles Lukens Houston responded to the sales pitch from Suffern & Son, who sent an engineer to analyze their fuel efficiency. The engineer went through the plant and issued a report, the last page of which is seen here. Charles Lukens Houston responded point by point with a 5-page single-spaced letter detailing why each recommendation wouldn't work. This is what he did when he wanted to flummox someone. He didn't want to pay their bill. The consultant provided graphs and charts that showed what each furnace produced and how the production could be improved. Consultants used visual, quantitative, and written communication in their reports. Houston did implement some of his suggestions, but still he refused to pay the bill. The consulting engineer, who was later fired from Suffern & Sons, wrote, "The part that really hurts, and is very hard for me to dismiss from my mind, is the fact that while you claim the service is to be of no value, you're still running your producers in accordance with our instructions." The business of consulting was new and not widely accepted, so battles such as these were common at first. The second engineering consultant that Houston used was the firm L.V. Estis. Their representative visited the plant, interviewed many managers, watched the production procedures, and immediately found cases of conflicting authority due to the split in the corporate structure, which he documented. He issued weekly progress reports detailing his findings. They were broken down into major problems with case numbers. Generally, Charles Lukens Houston then replied at length, case by case, stating why certain things could or should not be done. Some suggestions he implemented. The Estes representative also made charts and graphs of production and potential improvement. He wrote standards for the open hearth department and a weekly graphic chart to aid materials control. An outsider's view of a plant, especially if they've seen other plants of the same type, is invaluable in pinpointing problems. However, Estes had begun with a free trial period, and by the time they began billing Houston, it was the worst time for Lukens financially, and Houston couldn't pay. Eventually, Estes himself came and spoke to the board of directors, and eventually Houston paid. One of the main areas for improvement that the consultant suggested was in the reporting structure. There was no system to the hierarchy as it stood. It probably more resembled a tangle of branches. So the consultant created a hierarchical organization chart. The reporting structure led up to Charles Lukens Houston, but it did not include the sales side of the office run by his brother Abram Francis Houston. The org chart was a large blueprint, approximately 4 by 6 feet, and it was posted around the plant. It's too large to show clearly, so here are some details. In this chart, for the first time, you can see what official title an individual had and what jobs existed. Prior to this, everyone did what was necessary without giving it a name. It was a nice chart, but it didn't work. It didn't address the split in the company, and until that was addressed, no progress towards a unified corporation could be made. However, overall, the actions of the Estes representative and Estes himself gave the board of directors the outsider's view it needed, especially in the section of the overall report called excessive payroll, or, as Charles Lukens Houston called it, quote, the intricate question of man-hours. Although Houston was writing articles for Systems magazine, there was no system at the plant, and he admitted it. Actually, he saw it as a form of virtue. When the board of directors created a new office of the comptroller with authority over the workers' wages, Houston felt it was a personal attack. When he found the workers would henceforth be paid by check rather than cash, he resigned. It meant ceding control to an organization rather than an individual, to many individuals rather than a few. Abram's son-in-law, Robert Wolcott, took over the business. I know more about this time at Lukens Steel than any other. This is because they held weekly meetings and the stenographer typist transcribed them word for word. Meetings were beginning to emerge as a corporate tool. In them, all of the various units of the plant could rapidly exchange information once a week. This is an attendance sheet for the meetings. Each meeting had a general format. W.H. Hamilton started by reading the tonnage numbers for the open hearth and plate mills, and then they began discussing whatever issue was most pressing. In 1918, the most pressing issues were the difficulty getting good coal, labor shortages, building camps for black workers coming from the South, and the Philadelphia influenza that killed 42 of their workers. They also discussed ongoing construction, chemical reactions in the open hearth furnaces, and many other topics. In the transcriptions, I can hear the voices of the managers. When Houston hired Estis, the consultant abolished these large meetings and replaced them with what was called the manufacturing board meetings, just the upper managers, transcriptions of which were bound in this book. Since there were fewer attendees, the meetings were much shorter. They too started with a weekly production report and have many interesting things in them, such as the current economic downturn, the laying off of workers, discontinuing the company camp, the ongoing attempt to get a grasp on how many people worked there, and the back and forth accusations of who was responsible for rejected plates. These transcriptions continued through the transition in 1925 to the new president, Robert W. Wolcott. Consultants' reports are interesting not only because they contain technical information and lay the structure of an organization bare, but because they do this largely by writing. It's another example of Yeats's, quote, rising above the individual memory to create a corporate one. Except that, in this case, it's rising above a corporation's memory to create a professional one, consolidating group knowledge from a wider base. Writing had come not only to be used within individual industries, but to connect the industries in a web of shared knowledge that continued to grow over time. Lukens bought knowledge from Estes just as corporations continue to buy knowledge from consultants today. This knowledge is mainly conveyed in written reports.